Morning, everyone, and welcome to this webinar on building a culture of compliance, which is hosted today by Fintelekt Advisory Services and the Institute of Banking and Finance, Cambodia. And this is the first in a series of sessions that we will be organizing, jointly with IBF this year for the benefit of all the banks in Cambodia. By way of introduction, my name is Shirish Pathak. I work at Fintelekt, and it is my pleasure to be your host for the webinar today. I'm also joined by our expert trainer, Vikas Tandon, as well as by Vishal Su, who's General Manager of IBF Cambodia, who I'm sure most of the audience knows very well already. So at the outset, let me thank Vishal and IBF Cambodia for partnering with Fintelekt. We deeply appreciate it, and I hope we can, over the next few years, truly help with capacity building in the Cambodian banking and financial services industry in the area of AML CFT and financial crime compliance. I would like to now invite Vishal to deliver the opening remarks. Vishal, over to you.
Right, Shirish, morning and welcome to Cambodia, all those virtually for the time being.
Thank you.
All right. Yeah, okay. So thank you for hosting the webinar today to the banking professional in Cambodia. I think for IBF, it's our pleasure to partner with Fintelekt to enhance and sustain capacity development for the banking and finance sector in Cambodia. I think to everyone, the audience, I think as you are aware, last month, Cambodia was removed from the FATF, which is the Financial Action Task Force grey list, which is very good news for Cambodia. I trust this resulted from a collaborative effort for everyone in the industry, be it the regulator, the associations in Cambodia, the financial institution, and last but not least, the professional bankers in Cambodia. However, for IBF and everyone in the financial sector, I think what is more important for us now and in the future is to keep everyone informed and updated of the latest trends and insights in such areas as compliance, anti-money laundering, risk, and such, so that we can ensure Cambodian finance and banking sector is heading toward a prosperous future. And that's why for today's webinar, we look specifically on how financial institutions can build a culture of compliance at their workplace. And I do encourage any questions from the audience to our speaker today, Mr. Vikas. So I think you can drop the questions in the chat box if you have any. All right. Okay. So once again, thank you, Fintelekt, Shirish, Vikas, as well as IBF team for organizing this webinar. And I wish everyone a productive morning session. Thank you.
Thank you, Vishal, for those opening remarks. I think we just lost Vikas there for a bit online. Let me just wait till he logs in again. Vikas, just let us know when you're online again. Yes.
I'm back, Shirish. I think I had some audio issues, so I had to relog in.
No problem. So, we just finished the opening remarks by Vishal. I think one of the key points that Vishal made is that recently Cambodia has been taken off the FATF grey list, and that is, I think, testimony to all the work that the various stakeholders in Cambodia have done over the last few years, which has helped with this. And I think now it's a matter of going forward, in this space. So Vishal, thanks for those opening remarks. And before I invite Vikas to make his presentation, I thought let me just give you a quick background on the topic for the benefit of the audience, and why this topic is really so important. Now, it has become imperative for banks and financial institutions to actually demonstrate the right culture of compliance. And that is really to maintain their own reputation, to be trusted by investors, by the regulators, and by their customers, and finally, to avoid regulatory penalties as well. Because if globally banks are coming under increased scrutiny by regulators for non-compliant behavior. And the result of this, as we see in the media and press, is, huge fines that are being levied. So implementing a culture of compliance in line with the stated risk appetite of the bank, this is something that requires continuous time, effort, and resources. so that actually a sustainable change of behavior is possible. Now, having a robust compliance culture usually means that each employee in their bank knows their own responsibility and how that translates into expected daily actions and behavior. A positive, far-reaching change usually occurs when bank staff is made aware of the benefits of compliance and not merely the negative effects such as penalties. So it's very important, whether a carrot or stick approach is followed. So it is, important for banks to go beyond the, proverbial tick mark approach to building a culture of compliance, and additionally put in place policies, procedures, technologies, and frequent learning opportunities such as this one, that can actually effectively mitigate risk for the institution. Of course, this is all easier said than done, and it is definitely a lot of hard work. So, I'm going to leave all the hard work of this webinar to Vikas, and we have requested him to cover, certain key issues that will be beneficial for all of you attending today, such as, what are the characteristics of a healthy compliance culture? What are the key elements that are required to build it? How should the tone from the top be set? What should be the involvement of the board of directors and senior management be in setting and implementing compliance policies? And how can many of you as legal and compliance professionals actually help with that as well? How can banks reduce their risks by creating and implementing a strong AML safety framework? What are some of the tools and processes and technologies that can be used? And what is the importance of role-based risk sensitization and ongoing skills development? So these are some, plus some more that Vikas will cover today. Before I hand it over to Vikas, let me just say a few words about him. So, Vikas Tandon has over 27 years of experience in banking, of which approximately 17 years has been dedicated to AML, KYC, CFT, in business control, fraud risk, compliance, and op risk management. Until very recently, he was the global head for the Citibank Institutional Client Group for the Operations Risk and Control Division, and he was primarily engaged in compliance and banking-related advisory functions, and he was based in New York. Vikas has designed and implemented programs, policies, and procedures for enhanced operational efficiency and standardization, and coupled with experience of working in the banking sector across Africa, Asia, Europe, USA, within consumer, institutional banking, international compliance, audit, and training departments. Now, during his long career, he has networked and dealt with regulators across various continents: Africa, America, Asia, Europe, and the Middle East. He is also a prolific writer and trainer. He has written a book on KYC, AML, and CFT, and authored several articles in international journals. And he is currently engaged now in giving back to the banking industry in his role as a trainer, and therefore training senior executives, board members, as well as compliance teams on various aspects of AML CFT. So as Vishal mentioned, the flow of the webinar today will be, we'll have, let's say, Vikas making a presentation first. We would encourage you to put your questions in the Q&A box, which is there at the bottom of the screen, so that after Vikas's presentation is done, we can ask him to answer some of the questions that the audience may have put up. So with that, welcome again, everyone, to the webinar today. And Vikas, it's over to you.
Okay. No, thanks, Sirish, and thanks, Vishal, for making it possible for us. I know it's a great opportunity, and it's always a learning experience when you are sharing in such webinars. I think the audience is also very wise. So I personally feel it's an opportunity for everyone, not only just to share their thoughts and views, but also to imbibe what people feel and learn from that. So it's very heartening. We have 80 odd participants on the call. And I know we have the right kind of audience, people from compliance and senior management and operations and risk and control and audit and advisory functions available on the call. So looking forward to a very engaging session. I know you will have questions in your mind, and I would love to hear them and see if I'm able to answer them as far as possible. I'll try to do that. If not, we will certainly reach back to you with the appropriate response as possible. But once again, thank you for making it possible, and thanks, Sirish, for putting it together Obviously, the contribution of Vishal is very important because these webinars are becoming increasingly important. And as Sirish mentioned in the starting itself, that currently it's imperative for banks to demonstrate the culture of compliance. And non-compliance definitely is leading to a lot of concerns and issues. Also, I think why suddenly compliance as a culture is picking up in a big way, because we have realized that compliance is not just the responsibility of the compliance department, but it is the responsibility of everyone in the organization. Each one is very, very responsible, and they need to understand how critical it is for an individual to look at things in the right manner, understand what the regulatory requirement is, what the organization's expectation is, and then move in the righteous manner. If you look at the compliance department today, is not just dependent on designing the framework or putting the regulations into play, what the regulators may require, but I think they are increasingly getting a place on the table with the business, and they should be seen as partners, not as people like they have come here to audit or they have come here to find out issues or concerns. No, the compliance department is a big partner with the business folks, and that's how we should feel and play ourselves, because until unless you engage and interact with the business, they would not share the right things with you. The other important reason for this is, if you look at, the organizations have become too large, and these are called like a fixed cost. Compliance is called a fixed cost. If you go and speak to the regulator and say, you know what, I want to downsize my business, and so I'm keeping, let's say, just a rep office in any country, they will say, sure, please be feel free and do that, but there are certain fixed costs which you need to understand, and compliance is one of them. So you still need to have a compliance officer or an oversight, even if you just want to maintain a rep office in any country. So I think while we move with the points in the right manner, and I will go pillar by pillar, what is critical for maintaining a culture of compliance, we need to first understand why is it becoming increasingly important. And if you look at, the world is changing, the organization dynamics are changing, the regulatory approach is changing, and two main things are happening with that. One, the regulators have started talking to each other. So globally, you will find now the regulators are engaging and interacting very often, and they are picking up the best practices of any country or regulator that are existing, and then going back to the regulators and saying, you need to implement these. So one is the global interaction at the regulatory level, which has started happening. And two, the regulators have started taking in some countries an intrusive approach. Now, some may ask, what do you mean by intrusive approach? So earlier, if you look at, regulators used to only provide guidance and a broad guideline that this is what the expectation is from the regulators or from the organization or from the financial institution. Now they have started getting into the intrusive approach in some countries, where they are saying, this is what we want you to do. May it be in the field of AML, KYC, CFT, compliance, risk, whatever it may be. So I think with this, if you look at, it's increasingly important that organizations understand the requirement and what really is required from the organization's point of view, from the management's point of view, from the employee's point of view. And culture is not something that can be built overnight. So we all know that, building a culture takes time. It's not something that can be just, it's not something like you send a message out saying, this is what we need, and you'll find it happening in the organization. It really takes time. There's definitely a need for top-down approach. I mean, as Sirish, I think, mentioned, and Vishal also agreed on that point, that any important issue or concern that the organization has to look forward to has to be focused. And that focus can only come if there is a top-down approach. I'm not saying that the team below is not equally responsible, as I started by saying, each one is responsible for compliance, but the tone from the top makes the difference. And it is always the responsibility of then each individual in the organization to see how they are, taking it and whether it's getting implemented in the right manner. So I will share some examples as I go along to say what really compliance is. And one very important statement which was made by Fedorov in US was compliance is all about kind of self-discipline. So right in the middle of the night, let's say if you are standing or if you're driving down and you see a robot or a signal which is red, the self-discipline is to stop at that. And we often tend to think, oh, it's middle of the night, there's no one, watching us, there's not much traffic, so why stop? Just go through. Now that's self-discipline, that's compliance, that you stop at where you are required to, wait for the signal to turn green, and then you move on. So I think, compliance is not something that can be only managed or looked at by the management or by the compliance department. It is something that has to be imbibed. It is a culture that has to be built in. And once you find that culture happening, and there are many examples in countries that are doing it. I mean, you would know if you go to some countries, not only will people stop or the vehicles stop at the signal or the crossing, but you would also find people not crossing the road till it is the right time for them, or the signal changes, or it's like, now the pedestrians can walk through. So I think those are countries that are seeing the change. Obviously, it becomes like a self-discipline, and that's progressive. So having said that, let me walk you through several aspects of creating a positive environment and what is called a positive compliance culture within the organization. So I'll take one by one. The first, let me break them down into several pillars. And I think Suresh rightly mentioned on some of them, like getting rid of the tick box approach is one important aspect. We need to ensure that we are not just following the tick box approach. Conducting the compliance need analysis, that's another critical one. I think we all need to understand that compliance does not happen automatically, right? And once it is done, it doesn't mean it's there forever. You have to keep analyzing, looking at what the organization changes, what the requirement is, what the expectation is. The third pillar that we will talk about would be developing a plan and a program. So it's very important for us to understand that until unless there is something that is documented and written, it is difficult for people to comprehend. Like when you join any organization, you look at what is called the code of conduct, right? Every employee or every individual, when they join the organization, they are served with a code of conduct. The purpose of that code is that this is what the minimum expectation of the organization is. Not everything can be documented and laid down, but obviously once the tone is set, once the direction is set, people can follow it clearly. Changing the culture of the compliance also calls for looking at the target audience, what your target audience is, what is the expectation by the target audience, and what kind of compliance is required. I think that also becomes increasingly important. We also need to understand the culture of compliance that exists in the organization and how we need to improve on it or constantly work on that. So that will be also one pillar that we'll talk about. One very important aspect which we often forget as a pillar is retention. Now you need to ensure that there is enough retention managed in the organization to keep those heads alive and ticking. Because if you have only new audience or don't have experienced people, then the culture will not work in the manner or will not meet the expectation of the investors or the audience. So I think that also is important. We'll talk about it. And the last one that we will cover about is measuring the effectiveness. So it's always said, if you don't measure something, then you don't achieve it. If something is not measurable, it's not achievable. So once you put the plan through, once you put the approach through, there has to be a way to measure. So we'll talk about it. And as we said, while I talk through these pillars, I'm sure there'll be more. So I'm open and receptive. You can jot them down, share with us, or if you have any questions, we'll have it answered during the Q&A session. So let me start with the first one is, what do you really look at from a tick box approach point of view, and what do we mean by that? So what I'm trying to share with you is, it's very important to understand that having a checklist does not solve for anything. Because unless your employees in the organization have an approach which is an end-to-end approach, and when I'm saying end-to-end approach, let me explain it in a little more detail. So let's say you have your full-time employees, your part-time employees, your vendors, your contractors, all of them. Now, each one is following their checklist approach and thinking, okay, I'm required to do this. Is this done? It's done. Is this done? No, I'll do it later. The point is they need to also understand why are they doing something? What is the purpose? If they will not do something properly, how will it impact the organization? How will it impact the audience that they are catering to? So until unless we bring them under one roof, or even if not under one roof, we need to explain to them why are they being asked to do a particular activity and how does it impact the organization if they don't do it in the manner they are required to. So it is very important that we give them an end-to-end approach. Everyone who is part of the chain should know how the chain behind me is working and how the chain ahead of me is working. What is the activity that they do? What is my responsibility? And how would the people ahead of me look at it when I complete my role or responsibility? Because unless I have an understanding, I would not really feel comfortable doing what I'm doing. So it's important that we as organizational and senior management ensure that the tick box approach is not followed by saying, okay, we have a form, we have a set of things which everyone needs to ensure that they're doing it, but also make sure that they understand the purpose of the activity that they are doing and what is being expected from them by the other team members who are working in a collaborative manner. Maybe we would never see each other. Maybe we don't even meet each other or never even visit the department of the other people who are part of the chain. But that doesn't mean that I shouldn't be aware or have an understanding of what the requirement or the expectation is. So what follows through with that is training. Effective training is very important and key. And that's what we are here for. And that's what we endeavor to do on a regular basis for two reasons. One, if you don't carry out the right training, then you will not be able to deliver or share the expectations of the organization. So you need to have a standard training, but that training needs to be tweaked in line with the department or in line with the people that you are required to work with. So I cannot have a training which is a set training and say, okay, I'll give this to everyone. No, you will have to give a standard training which will have a broad outline, which will be same for everyone, and then explain to them why are they doing what they are doing. So that is what you'll have to customize, but otherwise it will be a standard training so that people understand clearly what this expectation or requirement is of compliance, who all are involved, who's doing what, and where do I fit in the whole system. So, effective training is very important. The next important thing that we look at is impact and effectiveness. And so whether this approach is impactful and how effective it is. So as I said, if you just have a tick box approach, then no one is going to evaluate or look at anything. But once you have a standardized training approach, all inclusive, and a collaborative approach, which is bringing all the individuals together, I think the next important thing comes in how impactful it is. Am I achieving what I'm required to, and how effective it is? So what's the end goal? Am I really achieving that or not? So when we talk about this, I think we forget sometimes and say, oh, I have a set of people who are trained. I agree with you. But what about the new joiners? What about the new hires who are coming into the organization? The vendors that you have, the contractors that you have. So it equally becomes important that there is a continuous, session, or you might say revisiting the training, making sure that people who are joining your organization or who are new and coming on board are also trained in a similar manner as my existing employees are. And they need time. So any new person who joins the organization, you can't expect that person to have, same kind of learning or experience immediately. So it's very important that we, have a plan, a calendarized activity where we train our new hires on a very regular basis, or the vendors or the contractors, and finding out that who's joining when. There has to be a discipline around it. How much time would that individual have to get trained before he or she hits the workshop and takes over the responsibility of the employee or the vacancy that may have been created. So very important to understand that we need to have an effective training, we need to have an assessment, and we need to have a calendar or a plan to ensure that we are training the new hires in the right manner, and including not just our regular staff, but the temporary staffs and the contractors and other people also. The next important session that needs to be looked at as part of the tick box approach, which is not considered to be good, is the compliance officers and the awareness of the team. So it's not again just the responsibility of the compliance officer to manage it, but he needs to have a team. He needs to have a robust system in which he's making sure that his team is geared up to reach out to people, to ensure that they are sharing the right things with the people there. They are aware of what they are doing on a regular basis, because regulations keep changing. So requirements keep changing. The regulatory expectation keeps changing. So you will have to ensure that the compliance officer and the team is fully aware of what the latest changes are, which all departments would get impacted, which all so-called checklists will get impacted, and then ensuring that they are updated not only just in a timely manner, but implemented in the manner that is required or expected from the regulator. And then the last point on the approach is the temp staff. Sometimes we tend to forget that we have, as I said, vendors and contractors and full-time employees, but we also bring in temporary staff. And then we say, oh, we are just bringing them in for doing this small piece of work or small job, which is maybe not so critical. But we forget the point that even this temporary staff, who may not be doing something very critical, is part of the chain. So they also need to be explained and taught of what the expectation of the organization is, how their work is going to impact the people in the chain. So that's very important. So this was the first pillar that I wanted to cover, which is about not having just the tick box approach. The next one that I think is important, as I said, is doing the needs analysis. Now, what really is required as part of needs analysis? So very important, again, we need to ensure that on a regular basis, we have an approach of checking what is the organization goal, where is the organization heading to, what is the expectation of the organization from compliance. And in doing so, I think we need to look at various components as compliance officer as to what is really required by the organization. And we need to have a place on the table, because we need to understand where is the organization heading to. What is my target for the year? Are we planning to introduce some new products? Are we planning to change our line of business in some manner? So until this you are really aligned to it, you will find that you're losing out. So having the approach of doing a needs analysis becomes very critical. And that has to be a constant activity, because otherwise you will find that compliance is way behind and the goals of the organization are not aligned to the compliance requirements. So I'll give a simple example of that. let's say there are certain red flags indicators that are being created currently, and the compliance department may be looking at them on a regular basis, whereas the business changes into a different direction or brings in a new product. And that calls for new red flag indicators, which we may not have inculcated or built in our system. Now, if we have not done that, we will find that we are losing out, and that may not be good. So it's important that we align ourselves by looking at what the organizational requirement is, what the expectation is, because any failure in that would lead to negative news, regulatory criticism, and that's not good. So there has to be a constant improvement in this whole process. Now, often we find that compliance is said that, okay, they need to train people. They need to reach out and make sure that they're doing those kind of analysis and making the changes. That's true. And any change that the compliance department is bringing in has to be aligned not only just with the regulatory expectation, but documented in a manner so people can follow the same approach. And if you look at the current context, the number of changes that are coming through, both from the management and from the regulator, are very frequent, because obviously it's become a very dynamic world. The regulators are learning, they are coming back to implement the changes, and at the same time, business is moving at a much faster pace. So that was the second pillar. Let me move on to the third one, which is equally important, and we need to understand why it's required in this manner. So again, the third pillar that we were talking about is, sorry, I think in my video stop.
Yeah, it's back now.
Sorry. So, the third important point that we would want to talk about is developing the program and the plan. Now, as I said, every change that is happening has to be documented. And why it is to be documented? Because we need to convey the same message. All organizations are going very global. You have the presence in different countries, you have people in different countries, you have different set of people sitting in different countries. So like, you may have your compliance team sitting in 10 countries, but the business might exist in, let's say, 20 countries. You may have people sitting in operations in one country, you may have people sitting in back-end activities in another country, you may have sales staff sitting across the globe, you may have management, people all over the place. So how do you ensure that the same message is conveyed and communicated? So it's equally important that we have developed a program and a plan which is standard and which is globally applicable. And then you may have certain changes or requirements which may be country-based. So you need to have a global plan or a global standard which has to be followed by everyone. But there may be a need or a specific need for some different requirements which may be specific to the regulator of that country. And that may be very stringent or applicable only for a particular country or location. So you cannot replicate that or copy that across the globe. So it's important that we understand how do we develop a program which is very effective and which exists in a manner which is very critical. And for that, it becomes important that we determine the potential topics. How do you look at what is critical? What is required from an AML point of view? What is required from a KYC point of view? What is required from a CFT point of view? And some of those requirements may be very standard, and some of them may require tweaking based on the location or the geography that you may be operating out of. So e-learning and classroom sessions become very handy. Now, it's always good to conduct some e-learning sessions or classroom sessions, but nothing to beat a face-to-face. And why we say that is because when you are doing an engagement which is face-to-face, one, it brings a very good connect between the person who's wanting to communicate certain important aspects or training and the audience that is on the receiving end. Two, you understand the body language. So something critical you want to explain and express is best understood when you are in a classroom session. And three, it becomes very engaging. Like if you see, to ensure that we are not interrupting or switching over the screens or, putting ourselves out of mute or anything, we have started by saying, I'm doing a monologue. If you have any questions, you can put under the Q&A session, which we will definitely answer. So this is one way of training that we are doing. But had it been a classroom session, anyone would have stopped me right there and said, okay, it's so simple. I have a question, or I want to check on this before you move forward. And we answer that or discuss that point there and then move ahead. So technology is great, but it has its own challenges. And we all understand that and appreciate that. But there are certain things that can never be changed. And, one of them obviously is like being face to face. It's like, a very simple example, and you all may have experienced it, that if you have to explain your child something, you're talking to them one-on-one or bringing them under, a particular time or in a room and discussing that is very different versus when you're talking to them on the phone and they have a challenge and you try to explain to them. So the body language, the tone, the compassion that comes across when you are together is very different versus when you are on a screen or having a discussion. So I think that the point that I'm trying to make is that while you develop a plan or a program, it's important how you deliver and how often can you manage it in the right manner. So, e-learning is great, but classroom sessions make a difference because of the various aspects and points that we have said. The next point on this is the coverage across the organization. So as I started off by saying, we are all becoming global. We have presence, in every place and nook and corner of the world. So the program needs to be standard and needs to cover everyone, because the regulators today are becoming very rigid in some of the countries and locations, if you look at, and they say, I understand that you have a global program or a standard, but I don't see my country mentioned. I don't see that you have specifically talked about a requirement which exists in my country. And that's why you need to plan your program in a very, very, I would say, sensitive and peculiar way. Now, when I'm saying sensitive and peculiar, what does it mean? So as I said, you would have a standard global program, and then you can go in a section which may be applicable for that country only and talk about some of the requirements and regulation which are country specific. So you can mention specifically in your global program itself as an annexure saying, for X country, these 10 things are applicable. Now that brings in two important aspects. One, every person who is part of a particular country can go and quickly look at the annexure if there is something specifically required for that country. And two, if you have a regulatory engagement, the regulator feels comfortable that you have specifically taken care of their requirements, which are very different from any other country. So while you claim yourself to be a global organization, you have definitely taken care of the requirements that are country specific, and they feel comfortable about it. So when I'm talking of this kind of training, the other important aspect as part of the developing the program is we don't expect compliance officers to understand and know everything in the organization. I'm not saying they shouldn't, but there may be aspects which they may not be masters on. So it's always good when you are developing the program or conducting the training to have the subject matter experts coming into play. So bring them in, get their views, ask them to share their views with the audience, which makes a big difference. So that way, what happens is sometimes the audience has some questions, which the compliance officer may not immediately have an answer to. But if you have the subject matter expert available with you or has collaborated with you, then we are able to take care of that in a very beautiful manner. So it's important that we bring in this expert approach, and we have the train the trainer approach, where the compliance officer is making sure that they are increasing their approach and bandwidth, which may be very limited in terms of compliance officers that may exist in the organization. So by train the trainer approach, what you are doing is you are creating people like yourself who may exist in locations and geographies and countries where you may not have your compliance team. So it's important to understand that, train the trainer program is very important. Not only should it be done, once, but again, as I said, you need to calendarize it, make sure that your knowledge is shared with these people and these people become your eyes and ears and arms. So that's very important. The fourth pillar that we talked about was changing the culture of compliance. Now, as we started off with the discussion that changing the culture is not simple. It doesn't happen overnight. It takes time. It takes a lot of efforts. And most of the time, as I said, there has to be a top-down approach. The management, the senior management of the organization needs to understand the importance of certain changes or requirements that come in from time to time. And they need to make sure that people at the ground are getting the same message. Because otherwise, you may have an approach which may not be in the interest of the organization, which may not be acceptable to the regulators, and which may not be in the interest of the audience or the investor, or so-called the consumer or the customer of the organization. So it becomes equally important that we have an approach which is understood by all, and which is like bringing in that culture in a very different manner. And how do you do that? I think again it becomes very important to understand that changing the culture, while it's not simple, you need to influence people. And how do you do that? So compliance officers of the organization have a very important role to play in building the culture and influencing the people. Now, we all know that you may be in the compliance team, but people on the other side are not ignorant of what is happening around the globe or what is happening in the field in which they are working on. So influencing people is not simple. And how do you do that? You can only do that by first being convinced yourself. You need to have the conviction that what is being asked or is required is doable, possible, and critical at the same time. So you need to have the right examples with you. You need to have the right case studies with you. You need to share what really happened with maybe the peer organizations or the peer financial institutions or your competitors to explain. They may have got penalties or strictures or just a warning. And with these examples, when you sit with the management and explain to them, they are open and receptive. They understand why you are coming up with this requirement. So it's very important that we need to be focused. And with the focus that we bring in, we need to carry the right examples and right rationale in asking the management to do something. Otherwise, you'll be stuck. Every time people feel, oh, compliance team, they are showstoppers. We are not there as showstoppers. We are your partners. We're just making sure that we bring in the right things to you. We have the shades of gray. We study why it's not black and white and it's gray, and give the approach in a very sensible and sensitive manner. There may be times when you really have to reach out to the regulators also to clarify certain things and then understand from them what is the rationale for this change or where they are coming from. And then if you go to the management, you will have the right justification. So it's all about, as we started off by saying, the right partnership. You need to find a place on the table with the business. You need to be partnering with them in the right manner. And unless the senior management or the people in the other departments within the organization feel that you are the partner, you will find that your task is becoming very difficult. So we are not auditors. We are not external parties or third parties who are coming up with saying, okay, I'm just here to check and find out mistakes. No, we are not there to find out your mistakes or highlight your mistakes. We are there to find out if there are any gaps which we can bridge together. And we are there to support the business so that they do not get into any kind of problems and they don't put the organization into any kind of difficult situation. So we need to understand that. And that, as I said, can only come if you share the right examples, if you have the right case studies, and sharing with them why you're doing them. So as I said, it's important that compliance department for having the right, or changing the culture of compliance also calls for looking at the red flag indicators. Now, what are the red flag indicators? Each compliance department, depending on the organization and the activity they are into, can design the right red flag indicators. And so there is an early warning that comes up if something is going wrong. And the purpose of that is that these red flag indicators, again, as I said, are not standard or created one time. You can design certain programs, you can look at certain reports, you can create your own alerts to make sure that if something goes wrong, you catch them early, you go back to the organization or the team member or the management, share with them what your findings are and how you would like to improve on them. So it's like a series of communication that is required. And that's why compliance cannot say, okay, I made this communication some time back and that's the end of it. No, there is a need to be constantly working on it. You need to engage with your teams in a very regular manner. You need to engage with the other departments in a very regular manner. And you need to send a series of communication because people have a habit of forgetting. As I said, even if I were to complete this training today, let me tell you what we would retain would be only maybe 30 to 40% of what we are talking of. You'll tend to forget some in maybe 3 months' time. You will forget maybe 80% of it in 2 years' time, and maybe 90% of it in 5 years' time. So there is constant need for reiterating, there is constant need of retraining, there is constant need of recommunication. And as you know, today the FATF guidelines are changing so often. New things are coming up on AML, KYC, CFT. Unless you have the right communication, you will tend to lose out on it. So let me move on to the next pillar on this, which is know your business, know your people. Again, a very important point. No organization, no compliance team can be successful without understanding their audience, without understanding what the need of the hour is, without understanding what the expectation of the management is and where the organization is heading to. So very, very important. We need to have an approach whereby we, keep ourselves updated. And at the same time, we know what is the audience that we are dealing with. There are times when the organization moves on in a very different direction. So with that, what happens? If you as compliance team are not keeping pace, you will find that the guidelines, the bylaws, the programs that you have created have become redundant or not relevant. So very critical point to understand that we need to align ourselves with the business, understand what the goals are, and more importantly, who are critical in the organization. So this is one of the very important requirements which the compliance team needs to understand. And to bring in the right culture, you need to understand who is critical in the organization, who are the critical decision makers. Because for several reasons, you'll have to make sure that you have a place on their table. One, they might bring in new products. They might bring in changes which will be very critical for the organization. And if you don't align yourself or are not, knowing that who these people are, you will find that changes that are made on the business side are not communicated to you, or you may be unaware of. So know your critical people in the organization and who are the influencers, because sometimes the regulatory requirement or expectations are so stringent and so difficult that until unless you have the critical people of the organization with you, putting that change may not be possible. So for that reason, one, you need to partner with them. Two, you need to have an approach which is known. Now, with that comes a very important thing to understand. Like every other thing, like the world changing, you also need to understand that people behave differently. And when I'm saying people behave differently, if you look at, and I'll go to the mainstream point, that baby bloomers, as so-called, or the millennials, behave differently from, let's say, the contractors, from the temp staff, from the permanent staff that you may have. And with time, what has really started happening is, unlike in the past where everything was set on ice and people would know that, okay, this is what they have to do, it's well documented on paper, it's cast on stone. Today, the people who are coming on board, they need to ensure that they are satisfied. So they ask questions, they raise issues or not, I won't call them issues, but they have observations which need to be satisfied before they start working on it. So the dynamics are changing, and I think we need to understand as compliance officers, unlike in the past where the direction used to go from us and say, oh, implement this. That's not the case today. Today, people come back and ask you, why are you asking us to do that? And they have their thoughts, and sometimes very rightfully, they bring in their views and opinions, which makes sense to even go back to the regulator and check, can we do it in this manner? And regulators have also become open globally to say, okay, fine, we came out with this requirement, but I think considering what you're bringing in or the value that you're adding, we might make these changes. And we are seeing those happen. When I engage with regulators, I often find that they are receptive and open, and sometimes they make the changes basis the requirement of the regulatees or the points that the regulatees may have shared. So be open, just don't take everything at face value. Feel free to go back and question and ask. And that's what our teams are also doing with us. So again, as we said, it's very important that we understand the target audience and behave in that right manner. And last pillar that we were talking of, or the second last pillar, so to say, was the retention. So equally important is to understand that we need to have the right set of people with us. And when I'm saying right set of people, it is very important why we need to have a right set of people with us, because sometimes the organization missed the point by saying, oh, no problem. Is someone leaving? Let them go, right? We don't have to bother. And we don't care for our employees. They're enough available in the market. Yes, you're right. They're enough available in the market. But training your people, keeping them happy, putting the right kind of knowledge also comes with one more important task, which is the retention. Because if you don't have the right set of people and experience in your organization, you will find things will start going wrong. And regulators today are checking on it. Sometimes they ask, can you share the experience of people who are part of the compliance team? And then you find, besides one or two people, rest are all new. And they come back and challenge you saying, how are you ensuring the right culture when you don't even have the resources who know your organization well, who have been there with you through thick and thin? So it's very important that we need to have a right approach, in having an effective compliance team, whether you call it by retention or you call it by experience or you call it by learning over a period of time, but there has to be a good mix. Obviously, people will move, they will go, and they will change and they'll pick up other opportunities in life. But that doesn't mean that you will lose out on the value that you need to have within this team. Because as I started off by saying, the organizations are very large. Number of people in the compliance team would be handful. And so if you lack complete experience, knowledge, then it adds to the issue. So let me move on to the last piece, which is effective measurement. Now, no activity is good unless it is measured and it is effective. So often we find that there are changes that are brought into the organization. There are changes that are brought into the program and the process, but then they don't get implemented at the ground level. And we feel that, we have it in the document, we have changed our process, we have changed our approach, we have communicated to the people, so like everything is done. No, that's not the right way. You need to have a way to check the effectiveness of that. Now, how do you do that? So often the best way of managing it is any change that comes through, which is communicated by the compliance team, you may pick up some samples, say after a month or 30 days of that communication or training or awareness message that may have been sent out, and look at whether it has really been implemented at the ground level. And you may have to take samples from different countries. You just can't pick up at one place and so yes, it's effective and it's implemented in the proper manner. No, you often find that people understand things in a different manner. So same organization, same culture, but people understand things differently in different places. So sometimes it is very important that you pick up a very small sample, maybe one or two also, and check whether whatever message you gave or the communication that you sent or the change that you brought in has been implemented effectively at the ground level. And if not, what is that is really required? What is missing? Is there something that is required to change in the way you communicate? Is it something that you need to simplify? Maybe your language was not clear. Maybe what you were wanting to communicate did not get communicated in the right manner. So often I personally feel that when you create a message for the change or any communication, maybe ask someone to read, maybe ask someone to interpret and share back with you what is that they are understanding from this message. And if you think that that individual, and probably try that with the new team members or people who have been recently hired rather than people who may have been in the system for very long, or you can pick a sample of one person who's been there in the system for long and is experienced, and one new maybe person who has been hired recently, and ask them, can you read this message and share with me what is your understanding? And you will find that the understandings are different. If so, you can really check and do a revisit and say, okay, maybe my communication was not clear or the change is required. But the important point that I'm trying to communicate over here is that the effectiveness measurement is very important. With that comes the lessons learned. So often, I think the compliance officers feel that once they have communicated something, that's it. No, feel free to have a lesson learned session with your team. What is the feedback that you are getting? Ask for the feedback. Don't hesitate. Go out, reach out to them, check for feedback, ask them if we can improve in any manner, or if you find that there are certain things which may not be going right. Because in the end, often you'll find compliance may be blamed to say, oh, compliance didn't communicate in the right manner, or they never reached out to us, or they don't even ask for feedback. So we find this duplicative thing happening. We find this redundant thing happening, but there's no one to reach out to. So an effective dialogue with the people and reaching out to them not only gives a sense of partnership, but also gives them an understanding that if I have a problem of compliance, whom do I reach back to? So we need to have a proper process whereby we follow through, we communicate, we engage, we interact, take feedback, and then decide on what the next steps are. So as I said earlier, once you come out with a change, that is not the end of it. You need to have a constant process of reevaluation. You need to design your next steps and see what is really required. Also, sometimes I think it's important to look at how people are behaving for the changes that you are coming out. Maybe they find it very difficult to understand. Maybe they don't find a rationale. So maybe you can share some examples in your communication as to why this change is coming. What is the background? Why is the regulator asking for this change, or the senior management asking for this change? And what is the issue currently that is being observed, which you are wanting to correct through this change or this communication? So I think, I've discussed all these points and had a long monologue with you all. Like we started off, and Suresh and Vishal mentioned that we will have a Q&A session. So I'll come to an end on that. And the only point that I want to share with each one of you is that no matter what, the compliance, the culture of compliance has a lot of benefits. It comes with, keeping the employees comfortable, management happy, and regulators satisfied. So this is the mantra, if we may call. If you have the right culture of compliance, the compliance team is happy, the management is comfortable, the regulator is satisfied, and the organization is not found to be in the news for negative reasons. So with that, thank you so much. Thanks for being a patient listener, and we are open for Q&As.
Thanks, Vikas, for that very exhaustive session. I think we did cover a lot of ground. I think we will end the session here today. So Vikas, thank you so much for joining us, for sharing your thoughts. I hope we can do this face to face in Cambodia sometime soon with the help of IBF and support from Vishal. So before closing, I'll just like to announce again for those of you who missed it that we will be sharing an executive summary of the session today with all the participants. And all the participants will also receive a participation certificate in the next few days from us. And let me now hand it over to Vishal for the closing remarks. Vishal, over to you.
I think sure, Rich, and because thank you. It's been great to hear the perspective that you share. How we can build a culture of compliance, and I agree that it's a conversation not only between the compliance department but everyone involved in the institution that would make a not just strong but let's use the word resilient for the changes in the future as well. So for that, Vikas and also Cherish as well as Fintelekt, thank you for hosting the first webinar. And like you mentioned, I do look forward to welcoming you in person to Cambodia very soon. Then, thank you.
Thank you so much. It's really a pleasure talking to you all. Thank you.
Thank you, Vishal, and thank you, Vikas. Thank you, audience, for patiently listening. And I can see from the numbers that nobody has dropped out. Everybody has waited till the end. So that's always a good sign. We hope to see you either online or face-to-face in Cambodia very soon. With that, have a great day until we meet again. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye.